Hey, so the podcast today is with Dr. Rob Whitley. He's actually a doctor of psychiatry not too far from where we're at here in Montreal at the Douglas Hospital. So we met at the CIMVER conference, which is a Canadian Institute for Military Veteran Health conference here in Montreal, and we just hit it off. And he actually researches men's mental health issues, but specifically for veterans. I was like, dude, where have you been? So he was an awesome reference point to talk about, are we getting this wrong? Because we've surpassed a grim milestone, right? The veteran deaths have surpassed the amount of actual combat deaths. So suicide is taking more lives than Al Qaeda and the Taliban. That's messed up, man. I'm not going to lie. And I really wanted to get into the reason why that might be the case. Is it because we're just not treating things properly? And from Dr. Whitley's perspective, we've got the model messed up because the research shows one thing, but the actual practice shows another. And this isn't to say that I think therapy is bullshit by any means. I love my therapist. Shout out to Sabina. We're good. Don't worry. But what I am saying is that I think that we need to rethink the model, because I think the way that we're treating men's mental health is doing us all a disservice. And we need to stop being lazy and actually apply the actual research that's out there and not just apply a one-size-fits-all model to everybody. So stay tuned to the episode. It's going to be freaking awesome. I think you're going to get a lot of insights. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family if you find this content interesting. All right, that's it for me. On with the show. Hey folks, another episode of the Hard to Kill podcast coming at you. I'm here with Dr. Whitley. He's an associate professor of psychiatry at McGill University and a researcher at the Douglas Research Center. He's also the author of a recently released book called Men's Issues and Men's Mental Health. And he conducts research on veterans' mental health with a focus on resilience and recovery. And we met actually at the CIMVER mini conference in Montreal. And what piqued my interest was the fact that he's working on veterans' mental health and the idea of recovery. So, Rob, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, David. It was great to meet you. And the day we met was actually the day of the Quebec ice storm, or the Quebec.
It's true.
So I hope you didn't lose too much power or weren't too
Man,
inconvenienced. Because
it was a thing. It was a thing. I got home. I got home that day and it was just lights out. But downtown wasn't that bad. So I didn't think it was going to be bad when we got home. But there's no trees downtown. But when I got home, it was like Armageddon. There was branches snapping, cars getting smashed. It was insane. So we were out for about three days. But thankfully, my in-laws, they had power, so I was able to bring the kids up there, and my wife eventually went up there, and I was able to get some work done. But I was bailing out my sump pump, and I had electricians show up because it was just a disaster. And just over a span of it was like 8 hours, 9 hours of just insane weather, and then after that, it was like 2-3 days later, it was like 15 degrees. It was just a wild 3 days. So we got through it.
Well, all the people I know who were affected, who had some kind of military training, seem to take it a lot better than the people who had no military training.
It's funny that you mentioned that. Yeah, I couldn't wait. I was like, I feel so useful because I'm like, all right, we got to get stuff sorted here. Food, all right, okay, what's the deal with this food? All right, it's going to thaw. All right, we got to get that out. Okay, kids, yes, okay, cool, we got that sorted. Do we have like all the provisions we need? Cool, boom, 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 boom. Yeah, don't worry, honey, I got it. I felt like I was back on tour again. I was like, yeah, bring on the apocalypse, man. I'm ready.
And it's times like that when maybe people who haven't served in the military get an insight into how valuable it is that we have a military and people who are trained to deal with emergencies, and how if you go on exercises, sometimes that's how you have to live. You don't have much fresh food or don't have shelter, and it lasts longer than 3 days.
Yeah, the funny thing was like just a few. I'm in Dorval, so really like the next borough over, it's a borough of Montreal, is Lachine. Actually, maybe it's his own city. I'm not quite sure, but they had power, and so the gas stations were operational, and the McDonald's was open, and the lineup was insane. And I went into the grocery store and people were complaining, like, what are all these people coming from? Why is it so busy? Like these like cranky old men, right? And I just thought it was funny. Like they were completely oblivious that everything around them was blacked out except for here. So it was just this total disconnect, right? It was really funny.
Yeah, it was a interesting few days, wasn't it? But thankfully, it wasn't middle of January, because that would have been a lot worse.
Right. Exactly. So now I wanted to obviously know a little bit about you and your background, because you're dealing with veterans and their recovery from mental health issues. So to get started, I love having researchers on, because typically, and you were just saying offline that you're actually getting on podcasts, which is awesome, because I think a lot of the times research is done, but conveying the research, like you're an expert at research, that's what you do, you're really good at it, but getting it out to the public isn't always necessarily what a researcher is compelled or necessarily even that great at. It takes somebody else to kind of grab that research and be like, hey, this is what's going on at the research level, did you know? And that's where I like to use the podcast as a conduit for that research. So you got involved in psychiatry and mental health. So what was the story to get to where you're at right now?
Yeah, so it's very true what you say, that researchers have typically been people who are very at home in front of a computer, looking at analyzing statistics using complex computer programs, and being in a library, being in an ivory tower. And uh, I'm a people person, so I like being around people. I like meeting people. I like listening to people's stories, and I also like writing and looking at statistics. And I'm a bit of a data nerd, but really I'm a kind of people person. And in research, you can go in kind of two or three directions. There's the kind of office, library, computer direction, and there's one where you can go and you basically have research studies where you spend a lot of time with people, learning about people, learning about what makes them tick, learning about the barriers and facilitators towards their kind of recovery journey, their integration into society. So I went down the kind of more social science route rather than the neuroscience or the genetic or the psychopharmacological route in psychiatry, where I do studies where we get to know groups of people. We understand the barriers and facilitators, like I said, towards recovery if they have mental health issues. We try to understand the programs that help them. Part of my job is trying to create programs that can help people with mental health issues. And I've done a lot of research on men's mental health. So as you said in your introduction, I recently published a book on men's mental health, and done research on different groups of men, ethnic minority men, young men, and also on military veterans who are predominantly men. I think it's kind of 85% of veterans are male. And obviously I'm very interested and supportive of the experience of female veterans, but most of my stuff has been on men's mental health more recently.
Interesting. So as you started going down that path of looking at like men's mental health, what are some of the things that kind of stand out? And maybe before we get into, I guess maybe the treatment of men's mental health, or what you see from your point of view, what are some of the things that seem to be kind of like the general trends with men's mental health, and maybe you can give us shed some light on that.
Yeah, so I think let's start with something positive. That when I started writing and talking about men's mental health, which was probably maybe 10, 12 years ago, some people tried to discourage me from doing this. And it was quite hard to get any airtime in the media or even in the research world to get funding or to get support from the higher ups. And there was a bit of a view that, well, men are kind of already privileged in society, and men, I remember a student said to me once, men don't have problems, men are the problem. And
I knew you. I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going down that route. I knew it.
And it's not often I'm lost for words, but I was kind of a bit flabbergasted at that comment. And this certainly wasn't a majority view, and it wasn't a view from mainstream society. It was a kind of minority view, but from a minority that, were kind of powerful, from kind of higher ups in universities, from people working in the media, from other types of people. But there's been a sea change over the last decade where now it's become perfectly mainstream and even trendy to kind of talk about men's mental health. We have, Prince William and Prince Harry, who were the archetypal kind of stiff upper lipped members of the British aristocracy, now going on podcasts and news programs talking about mental health and the loss of their mother. And they've both served in the military. Prince Harry served in Afghanistan, talking about these kind of issues. We've had lots of other kind of celebrities, former military, sports, people involved in sports, entertainment. So the positive trend that I've seen is that there's much more willingness to talk about men's mental health issues. There's much more of an appetite to actually try and do something about it. And there's an openness to change. That being said, there's a lot of innovation and a lot of exciting new initiatives and programs happening around men's mental health, but they're not really getting the airtime that they deserve, and people are not really talking about them. And Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. At least in the official mental health care system, the kind of provincially funded mental health care systems, they're still doing a bit of the same programs and the same therapies, which are actually very useful to stabilize people with mental health issues, but they're not too good at helping in that kind of recovery journey, that progress from going from somebody in a kind of an acute crisis to going back to the person you were, or to being the kind of resilient person that helps you thrive in society.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that there's the stabilization phase. But then after you're stable, it's just like an injury, right? Like if your leg is broken, let's say you've got a compound fracture, it's brutal. You got to reset that. You got to stabilize it. You do that. And then after it starts to heal, then you've got physio, then you build back your muscle mass. But you're not always in that stabilization phase. That would be ridiculous, because it just wouldn't work, right? It would just be constant emergency care for something that is not an emergency anymore. And I'm glad you brought that up on the mental health side, because I noticed that, and I'm not a clinician, I'm not in that research sphere, but I recognize that as something where, especially with us guys, it's like we're always in this constant phase of, oh, you're in an acute crisis mode right now. How do we bring to bear all of these resources? When in my case, you said thrive. That's exactly where I want to go right now. I've got rid of the crisis phase. I'm not in the basement. I'm not lights off. I'm not wanting to dissociate myself with everybody and that I know, my family. I want to get really good because I want to help as many people as possible. I want my family to be good. But it seems like the same strategies are still being used. So what does that mean then to say, okay, let's go from stabilization phase to thriving phase, or, encouraging better habits so that you can be a better human being? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah. I mean, it might be interesting to take a little detour into the history of psychiatry.
Please, 100%.
Yeah, if you look at the history of how mental illness was framed by psychiatry and by mainstream society, it wasn't long ago where it was framed as a illness that was deteriorating, that was indelibly imprinted on the individual, there was a pessimistic prognosis. So if you think of like shell shock in the First World War, there were many soldiers came back from the Western Front with shell shock, and they were kind of encouraged to go into homes, and it was considered a disorder which was incurable. And that was the same for schizophrenia. It was the same for bipolar disorder, and that there was treatments that could help you kind of stabilize. But in the last couple of decades, there's been a kind of new model, which we call the recovery model. And the word recovery has been redefined. So recovery is no longer just symptom remission or stabilization, but it means making progress in the areas of life that you consider important, that the patient considers important. So that could be going back to school, getting an education. It could be starting a business. It could be getting into the workforce, changing jobs. Because in times past, people with mental illnesses were discouraged from going to work. They were discouraged from having romantic relationships and having children. They were discouraged from going to educational institutions. So if you read the autobiographies of people who are not who are in their 50s, 60s, so quite recent when they were young, saying that they were discouraged by therapists, by clinicians from getting a job, from having children. And we now have this new recovery model, which, exactly as you said, takes its inspiration from physical medicine. And one of the examples I give is that some people, maybe they injure their knee when they were a teenager in their early 20s, and the knee might never be 100% as it was, but it doesn't mean you have to stop walking, you have to sit in a chair for the rest of your life, and that you shouldn't have children and you shouldn't go to work. It just means, maybe you have to stop running marathons, but you can run half marathons instead.
Right.
It means maybe you're not going to play soccer for Barcelona, but you can still play on your local team and coach your kids and have fun with your life. And this is exactly the new model that we're using, which is stabilization is important, and that can be provided by kind of hospitals and official health services, and medication can be important. That's the choice of the individual. But then to make that kind of journey, and in the recovery model, we always use the analogy of a journey. That's going to require a lot of positive programs, a lot of positive self-talk from an individual, a lot of more like idiosyncratic factors of somebody, an individual, kind of getting to know themselves, or having clinicians or therapists or people around them helping them on that journey. So for one person, it might be exercise could be very helpful. For another person, it could be being outdoors, doing yard work. For another person, it could be starting a business. For another person, it could be reconnecting with family members that they might have become alienated from. So the recovery journey is a very idiosyncratic journey. And maybe this is where we'll go later in the podcast, but some of the research I do shows that the official mental health system is good for stabilization, but for that kind of recovery journey, it's less useful. And actually, what's more important is kind of civil society and the programs and organizations out there which are not funded by the government.
Yeah, as somebody kind of figured it out on my own, and then I got help on the back end. The things that benefited me were just training more, figuring out, like, I got a coach, and I just started exercising. That's why I do what I do now, because I realize the power of that. But I make no, I make no assumptions that this is literally for everybody. Going to the gym and lifting weights is good for everybody, but it may not be something that somebody wants to do when they're recovering. Physical activity, though, in general, is great for everybody and has great mental health outcomes just by going for walks, and that's what I'm doing now with a group of veterans. But the point of what I'm trying to say is that the recovery, like you're saying, needs to be idiosyncratic. There needs to be this kind of map where you see, oh, hey, well, you just started talking to your friends. You weren't doing that before. Big win, like high five. You start walking again. You start actually going outside. Hey, high five. But that's not something that your doctor necessarily is going to witness, or even your therapist, right? So I've been trying to kind of fill that gap in a way, because I know the power that mental health has. But on the side of for let's say men to get better, and this is a question I've had with other folks as well, and other veterans, it feels to me like the actual system is not geared, and I'm going to say for veteran men, to get better, because we have an experience. A lot of us are more, you want to call us like more type A, maybe more alpha male, maybe more prone to wanting to act and do stuff and be aggressive, but in a good way. But it seems like that side is not really encouraged as part of the mental health kind of healing model. Is there anything to that, or am I just taking a wild stab at it and just seeing what I see, and maybe it doesn't apply to anybody else except me and a few other guys?
What you said converges actually with a lot of the research evidence. So the research evidence shows that men in general, but especially veterans, prefer kind of action-oriented modalities of healing compared to talk-directed modality of healings. So what that means is a bit of a mouthful of a phrase, but like a modality of healing, we recognize that there are very different ways that individuals can heal. And we know that from cultural psychiatry. We would never try and impose a a Western way of healing on an Aboriginal community, we would now consider that to be unfair and possibly ineffective. But we need to recognize that there are very diverse modalities of healing. And when there are people who have conducted surveys or looked at differences between men and women and just broad statistical differences, obviously it's not predictive for every individual, that men like to be involved in some kind of action. So if you think about maybe, before there was a mental health system, or people who don't live where there is a mental health system, if there's a young man like having some troubles or wrestling with some issues, a typical thing might be, let's take the guy fishing with one of the older elders from the village, and that you're sitting shoulder to shoulder, you're fishing. Another thing we know, like hunting is used by Aboriginal communities to like try and reinsert young men who are having troubles, saying, look, we're going to teach you some new skills. You're going to come out with the elders. You're going to do something useful, which is then going to help us feed our families and feed our community. And that's another thing we see in men's mental health and with veterans, that they don't really like being kind of passive recipients of care. They like to be involved doing something, helping others, helping themselves by helping others. So some of the more exciting new research shows that wilderness-based interventions are actually very good for men's mental health and veterans' mental health. So you're smiling, you know what this means, getting some men who are having issues out into the wilderness, hunting, fishing, making fires, making shelters. The more experienced men maybe helping the less experienced men. And every man brings something to the table. Maybe a man who's good at fishing is not so good at map reading, whereas someone who's good at map reading is not so good at fishing, or someone who can start a fire from scratch. Someone's better at cooking. And the idea is everybody's helping each other. And in that process, people are being helped themselves.
Right.
So we have a phrase in men's mental health now that men heal shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. What that means is that shoulder to shoulder activities, exactly as you just said, David, I just wrote it down actually, a walking based activity where men are walking along shoulder to shoulder. You're doing something, you feel good, your endorphins are being released, and you're getting to know and trust people. And that might lead you to disclose mental health issues and get some helpful feedback. Like I said, fishing, even like driving in a car. We know, sometimes a dad will take his son, or people go out for a drive and they'll talk about things. Hunting is a shoulder to shoulder activity. So one of my big missions at the moment is really trying to spread the word about the importance of shoulder to shoulder healing. And people shouldn't feel bad or feel shamed if they don't want to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist and don't want to sit face to face and talk from day one about their innermost thoughts and worries to a well-meaning and well-trained person, but who is a stranger and might not, like you say, understand you as a man or as a veteran. There are lots of amazing veteran peer support groups across the whole country. I mean, you just talked about your walking group. You run one, kind of. They're also very good venues for that kind of healing and for that kind of support, which veterans are looking for. So, yeah, we do need to get away from the like one size fits all idea that mental health issues can be cured by medication and by talking therapies. That they certainly should be options. People should think if they want them, but there's all this stuff happening in civil society is really helpful for men's mental health and for the mental health of veterans. But sadly, they're often on a shoestring budget, if they have a budget at all, and they're being run by volunteers like you.
Yeah.
And one thing I always say is maybe the government should give kind of block grants to the community groups. That might be a better investment than just throwing money into big hospitals, which is a bit like a leaky bucket. The more money you throw in, the more it seems to evaporate.
Precisely. Right, exactly. Because their bureaucracies are so big, right? Like they have so many layers of bureaucracy over layers of bureaucracy, and everybody's got to take their cut. So I was having this discussion too, and there was so much what you just said there that I need to touch on, namely the going out into the wilderness. That's Warrior Adventures Canada. So shout out to the guys at Warrior Adventures Canada. I just had them on the podcast again. They're I don't know if you're familiar with the organization, but that's what they do. They take guys out in the woods, guys and gals from the military and RCMP, I believe, to have an adventure where it's difficult. They're going whitewater rafting. It's intense. Like there's danger, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's no phones. It just resets your neural circuitry back to this ancestral time where all you had to do is rely on your senses, rely on the guy next to you, and do your job, which is staying alive, but also just enjoying what nature has to give you. And like the anxiety comes down, and just I haven't been, and I definitely have made a point to get on one of their excursions because it just sounds incredible. And I always love being out in the woods. I mean, granted, the infantry kind of ruined that for me because I get nervous. I just get anxiety when I'm in the woods, like, oh, I'm going to be cold, I'm going to have wet feet. But I do agree. I've been even going. There's a little wooded area not too far from my house that has a really beautiful walking trail, and I just go there just to do my walks because there's a difference between walking in and amongst nature than walking on my suburban streets. That's for sure. And when you're talking about shoulder to shoulder, from the like little bit of knowledge that I have on men's psychology and like our neural circuitry, yeah, being able to communicate, we typically are obliquely to each other, and we'll talk, and we won't go face to face. And I believe that's because typically if we were hunting, we would be side to side and we'd keep our eyes open for whatever we were hunting. So naturally we're going to be more accustomed or comfortable being like, hey dude, like yeah, we're going to see that thing. Yeah, how you doing, by the way? Oh yeah. I'm not so engaged. And I noticed that with my wife. When I'll talk, I'll turn away, I'll go to the fridge, I'll carry on the conversation, but that it annoys her. And I recognize that as a thing because she's like, why aren't you looking at me? And my son doesn't look either, but our daughter will. And it's a very interesting difference between men and women, right? They want to engage, be face to face, eye to eye. But us, I want to sit on the couch and just kind of have a conversation and look away and do almost like I'm doing something else. So I can understand why for a woman it may seem like I'm not paying attention and frustrating. But for me, that's just how I communicate. So it's just cool that you mentioned that shoulder to shoulder thing is validated. So I'll have to make sure my wife listens to this episode to, to get off my case a little bit.
Well, yeah.
But ultimately, I wanted to just bring up the funding thing too, as well. And I have noticed recently the Veterans Affairs Wellbeing Fund is a great fund. I'm sure you're aware of it. I'm a recipient for my Athena program. We put in another grant for one of our apps, which is to get veterans moving as well and active. But one thing that I've heard through the grapevine is that they are actively trying to find the smaller groups like myself, the nonprofits, the corporations that are doing these programs at a much more effective level because they don't have the big bureaucracy. They have the program that is getting directly to the community, and it's typically run by other veterans. So it's not this big overarching organization that has overhead and everything like that. It's targeting people in areas that may not be widely represented, but it's getting the results that ultimately they want because they don't want the veteran to be stuck, not healing, unproductive. The goal is to get you up and back into the community, reintegrated, because for me anyways, I see the veteran community, our recent veteran community, which I call like the global war and terror veterans. So, Afghanistan, Iraq, everything like that. We have different sets of, I guess, of concerns and issues. And essentially this kind of cohort, I see it as the next greatest generation, but a lot of us are hurting because we had these wide experiences and not many people knew what we were doing, but the amount of responsibility we had, the level of combat that we saw, the complications that we had to figure out, we've got a wealth of experience and knowledge to give back. But if we're not doing well, you can't do it. And so that's why I work so hard to try and make that happen. And that's why I want to have individuals like yourself explaining like, no, you can get better. This is definitely a thing. And so that's, I guess, where I want to take the conversation next is, based on your research, how is that recovery happening? What are you seeing? What are the protocols that need to be implemented? And like, where is this happening right now so that folks can start getting better and thriving again?
Yeah, so there's not a uniform standard across Canada. There's a lot of localized programs which are very helpful to people who live in those neighborhoods. or have access to those services. So I know those kind of wilderness interventions I was talking about in Alberta, they're very kind of popular,
Hmm.
and British Columbia, but the more kind of east you come across Canada, I find they have less prominence. But the upside of the modern world is we have this great thing called the internet that I'm talking to you on now,
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
and it's really good, isn't it? And there's lots of kind of peer support groups on the internet. There are um, podcasts you can listen to. There are YouTube that you can watch. So one thing that my research shows for this recovery journey is like there are three things that are kind of really helpful. Like mastering a new skill can be very helpful for your recovery because it gives you that self-belief that you are a human who's flourishing and thriving. You're not just a passive recipient of care who's stuck in a rut. And that could be a simple thing, learning a language, learning how to cook better food or a new food. It can be doing some yard work, some physical stuff, learning to do some yoga, stuff like this. And mastery of a new skill is really good for your mental health. We know, especially for veterans who have, when they were raw recruits, they didn't know anything. And then within a year, they could operate rifles, they could navigate, they could survive in the evening and sleep overnight for weeks on end in the wilderness, etc. So mastering new skills is really part of the military life, and veterans, I think, really want to keep that progress. The second thing, which I think is really important, is setting goals. So having a goal, setting a goal, short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals. And for every individual on a recovery journey, that goal setting should be tailored to the individual's circumstances. So for an individual who's in a bit of a bad way, sitting at home, lonely, a simple thing could be like, this week I'm going to go out every day and just walk around the block, or I'm going to walk down to the local park. Maybe I'll talk to someone who's walking a dog and just pat the dog and make some conversation. And to people who are more advanced on their recovery journey, it might be, I've always wanted to start a business. I've always wanted to start a podcast. I've always wanted to write a blog about my experience in the military. That can be setting goals. A third thing I would say is kind of controlled exposure. So we know that people with post-traumatic injuries, with other mental illnesses, sometimes they're afraid is not the right word. They're a bit concerned about being exposed to some kind of issues, being in crowded situations, being in shopping malls. And you can, in a controlled manner, you can expose yourself to some of these things you're afraid of. And that can help you in your recovery journey. And to go back to my original point, some of this is helpful if you can do it in collaboration with a therapist or with someone who's been there, done that, got the T-shirt in a peer support group. But there's lots of amazing resources on the internet now that can help people in these kind of journeys. That, like I said, there are peer support veterans peer support groups meet online. YouTube has a whole load of videos about self-improvement, skill acquisition, goal setting. There's a website I use a lot called Coursera,
Yes.
which is no affiliation with them, so I'm not advertising them, but I'm a kind of fan. You can sign up for free courses on all sorts of amazing stuff delivered by people with PhDs and with a lot of experience. So there's stuff for veterans in like their local communities, and there's stuff online. Maybe a lot of veterans in Canada live quite physically isolated and in the boonies. And I would say they're kind of they're the kind of things that people should be thinking about if they're isolated, if they're lonely, if they're on that recovery journey. How can I use the internet to help me, and how can I use a local community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that brings me to Sebastian Junger's book. I don't know if you're familiar with it, called Tribe.
Yeah, I've read it. Yeah, I read it a few years ago.
And yeah, I mean, it's a short read. He's not a veteran, but I read his other works, and he's a great reporter. And I just thought it just hit the mark in the sense that a lot of us, when we come home, most people can't really, if they haven't been deployed or if they haven't seen combat, get the idea that a lot of us kind of want to go back. And but it's not the combat. It's the camaraderie. It's we are a team. We're surviving together feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I don't get to replicate here, right? I don't feel that sense of, wow, I'm super important right now. Everybody's relying on me and I'm relying on everybody else. That doesn't exist. And the closest we got was the little mini ice storm, like
Yeah.
you get a little taste and you go, oh, I remember this. This feels good.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
family like needs me. And it's not life or
Yeah.
death by any means, but there's a little bit of stress and it feels good. It's not mundane and I like it. And I think a lot of us miss that, right? And so to be able to kind of bring that to the forefront of your healing, where it's like, well, it's not going to be in a combat situation, but we're social animals. You got to find a way to bring your tribe together, and it may not be your army buddies, it may not be a single veteran, but it may be your neighbors, it may be people on the home and school committee, maybe. And that's something that I kind of had to get my head around, where I struggled. I just needed to make more connections with literal human beings that are in my surrounding area to start making a better community for myself. And it's helped substantially. And I'm not in an isolated area, so it's easier. I get it. But the internet is definitely a good, I guess, medium for that, in the sense that it can connect you with people that could potentially put you together physically. So on that front, individuals, if I understand correctly, veterans, it's really getting involved in your community, and having a sense of, okay, I'm useful and I'm progressing on doing something new. Like part of the healing process is using your brain in order to solve some problems and to gradually integrate new things so that it's not too much of a overload, so you don't get thrown back into, I guess, like your baseline, which is not where we want to be. So I think I got that right in summary, right? We want to take it slow. We want to integrate some new stuff, and we want to make sure that we're social. I think that's the gist of it.
Yeah, and I would like to just add one more thing. That is the gist of it. It's a very good summary, which is what we can call like the receiving environment or the receiving community. So veterans who might be struggling should definitely not beat themselves up about the issues they're facing, because there's been a massive change in society in the last like 50, 60 years. There's been a massive decrease in, for example, people who go to church or to places of worship, to trade union membership, volunteering, people who, if you count the existence of like sports clubs, Rotary, Elks, these kind of organizations, they've all lost members. So there was a Harvard sociologist called Robert Putnam who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And the title is a summary of the book, where he looks statistically at the changes over the last few decades. And he says there are more and more people like bowling alone.
Really?
Whereas we think he's talking of bowling alone is like in America, apparently where he's from, bowling is a big hobby, and people used to do it with groups, and now they just go and do it on their own. But he talks about, church attendance, trade union, volunteering, cadet formations, people who are volunteering in cadets formations, these kind of things. Whereas the veterans who came back from the Second World War, they came back to a society where all that was flourishing, which means if you wanted to take a leadership role, if you wanted to give, basically, that's the word we should always remember, that veterans like to give. They don't just want to be passive recipients of services. That There was an environment where it was easy to do that. You could become a youth leader in your church. You could become a leader in your cadet formation. You could become a trade union rep. You could become the chairman of your local Rotary club or Elks club or whatever. Whereas a lot of that's shrunk in Canada and the US, all over the Western world. People have become more just bowling alone, like Putnam says. Mm-hmm. So it's tough. It's not easy to find those kind of responsibilities. Volunteering has decreased because of especially for men. Because there are some concerns which, sometimes they're unwarranted, but people are worried, well, I'd like to volunteer at a cadet formation or volunteer at a local sports club. But, people are, we live in a culture now where people are worried, some men are predators. Are people going to think I'm a bad egg? Nobody knows me in this community if I just turn up at the local sports club and say I want to teach the under 13s soccer team. So there's these internal barriers that some men have internalized due to these kind of cultural changes over the last few decades, which means that it's not as easy as it was as the generation who came back from the Second World War to kind of reinsert into society and become someone who's giving something back and playing a role and having a meaning in their life beyond just their individual kind of satisfaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The World War II generation, everybody went. Everybody had a role to play. So it wasn't as if a veteran came back and the people were asking, "Oh, what did you do? Oh, you were at." There was no question as to, well, obviously, like we saw, like we were making the bullets for you. We were, collecting provisions for you. We were buying war bonds. It was everywhere. Everybody was doing something. But in comparison to what we experienced, we came home and I can talk to 90% of the people and they have no idea that what it means to be a veteran, but like even the war in and of itself, it's so foggy. It's not something that really had an impact on anybody that wasn't part of a military family. And so that's kind of the disconnect, because it doesn't mean anything to a lot of people to say, well, yeah, I fought in Afghanistan. And the only interactions I've gotten were either, like nonplussed or, oh, you must be really fucked up. And it's just like, well, good to meet you. I mean, like, I don't like, right, yeah. I'm just a human, man. I just did a job. I don't know. I don't think so. But it's unfortunate that you have that impression in your mind, because obviously that was something that you learned from, whether it's media or whatnot, that, Afghanistan must equal mental health disorders. So that's the thing I wanted to segue into with respects to healing, and how do we get to the point where we can start looking at the post-traumatic issues, which it's bad. I mean, we're losing more veterans to suicide than the actual war itself. So clearly there's an issue. There's something needs to change. The most promising thing that I heard was when I was in Las Vegas last year, was the veterans that are there starting businesses. They were saying, no, man, this is our time to grow and heal, and we're going to do it through business. And I love that message, because that's what I embody here. But how's the message going to change? Because it sounds promising. From what you're telling me, it sounds that no, we can fix this. It's just, it sounds like a messaging issue, that we can get past this and we can heal and we can be better. So what needs to change, in your opinion, in order for us to start not only convincing veterans, but also convincing everybody else that just because you're a veteran and you have mental health issues doesn't mean that's it forever, and we're going to grow through it and we're going to be better because of it?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I think there's a bit of a problem in Canada, in as much as I cannot remember the exact figures. So what I'm going to tell you is very rough, but I think in the United States, it's something like 1 in 4 people have a member of their kind of close family has served in the military. Whereas in Canada, I think it's something like 1 in 25, even maybe 1 in 50.
Yeah, I'd say it's close to 1 in 50. Yeah.
1 in 50, is it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which just means that the average person in America, their brother or cousin or someone in their family has served in the military or in the National Guard, that's part of the military, in the full-time military or the National Guard. Whereas in Canada, it's a lot rarer, meaning that the average, 18-year-old, the average 30-year-old, maybe older folks like me, we know more people, but has no immediate contact and doesn't understand what it means to serve in the military, and the motivations, why somebody would do that, why somebody would enjoy it, and why somebody would come back and feel that civilian society is not living up to their expectations. Or when I was excuse me, when I was at school in the UK in the 1970s, a substantial number of my teachers had served in one of the branches of the military in the Second World War, or they'd been involved in some way. Some of the female teachers were in the nursing corps or were working in factories,
right.
And it was my awareness of the military was quite powerful by the age of like 13, 14, 15, and I joined the cadets actually when I was like a teenager, because I was so impressed by what I heard and the sacrifices people had made. and that's not the case now at all. The people in these positions of influence amongst the younger generation, teachers and community leaders, have rarely served in the military.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough nut to crack. How do we sensitize the population to the reality of military life, and how do we help veterans? One thing I would like to say is an interesting fact is that suicide rates amongst the serving military are much lower than the general population, whereas suicide rates amongst veterans are higher.
Interesting.
And basically, so what I say is, it's when you're in the military, you've got such a sense of purpose. You're learning new skills all the time. You've got that camaraderie with your buddies. That is a real hedge against suicide, and makes you feel like your life is really important. And when people are discharged or released from the military, a lot of that sense of purpose overnight, without much preparation from the Canadian Armed Forces, it disappears. And in the US, maybe there's more of an appreciation for veterans. There's certain jobs which are kind of veterans get preferential treatment for, whereas in Canada that's less of the case. So I think what we need to do is have these kind of programs which allow veterans to get the benefits of military life without still being in the military. So it's like you said, camaraderie, physical exercise, doing things, helping others, helping the community. And some of the programs we've talked about already are doing a good job in that regard. But there's certainly a lot of scope for innovation and for invention as well, to try and create new programs which can, like I said, mimic those positive aspects of military life without obviously having to re-enlist in the military.
Right. Which I don't think many of us would take that torch back up. It's exactly. Good, thanks. So,
and you think that the Legion kind of used to do that? Well, that's how it was kind of formed in a way in 1918, the British Legion at least. But Lord Haig said it should be mimicking, and they have sergeant at arms, and they have parades, and they have their bar, like the officers' mess and stuff. And,
and that's one of those institutions, right? With time, it hasn't adapted to the times. It had a golden opportunity with all of us coming back, but they missed that opportunity, in my opinion, because when I came back, it wasn't the right fit. It was mostly civilian leadership that had no connection. And here in Canada, the last war we had was Afghanistan. Before that, it was really Korea, where we had a big group of veterans. And so what's that, 50 years of no veterans? We had veterans, obviously, but to actually have a combat veterans is a different story, because the army, the military is on a different footing. There's a different level of intensity. So we had a big crop come back, and we're all young, right? We're all in our 30s. And it could have been a awesome time to just get a big boost in membership. But there's just so many bad stories of folks feeling like they weren't welcome because they're just so entrenched in the way they were doing things. And it could have been a change in leadership, and could have been a change in just the culture itself. But there's other institutions out there, and I get it. Things change with times. And so it feels like we're trying to cobble things together right now. And some of us are started businesses, podcasts, nonprofits, and we're starting to get our legs under us. And I like seeing that in the community here in Canada, at least. And then the American communities are already well established. So making links with them, because they've been doing it for a while. It's basically, they've been at war since that they had a bit of time off during, like, after Vietnam, and then it's been nonstop. So if anything, they have a very well established veteran community that knows what they're talking about. So I want to know then, obviously you wrote the book. How's your book conveying this message, and where can folks get their hands on it and make sure that veterans like ourselves can start reading all the good stuff that you're putting out there?
Sure. So the book is available on Amazon, and it's published by a publisher called Springer. It's available on the Springer website. And alternatively, I mean, the book obviously has a price. I have a blog for Psychology Today where I write articles quite regularly about a lot of the things I've talked about. And that's free of charge, obviously, and it has a lot of hyperlinks and videos embedded to help people. I've also got a YouTube channel, Recovery Mental Health, which has a few videos related to veterans. Actually, we just released a new one about medical cannabis use amongst veterans. and interviewed some well-known veterans, including Brock Blazek, who's the well-known veteran who confronted Trudeau in Edmonton in the town hall. And
Asking for too much. Asking for too
yeah,
much.
yeah, right, yeah. Well, he's throwing money at every other group in society, left, right, and centre,
Yep.
causing hyperinflation. But yeah, so. But the main message of my book and my writing is really trying to. I'm not trying to be. I'm trying to be realistic, but also trying to be positive and optimistic. I'm always looking for good programs, for good ways that we can help men and help veterans, male or female, and trying to support them and offer ideas that maybe policymakers or community leaders can take up. And really, like, an ethos of self-help is behind a lot of what I do, whether it's as an individual or as a small group or larger group of individuals. That veterans, when you're in the military, if you have a problem, you can't call the police or you can't call somebody else and say, "Can you come and solve this problem for us?" The military has to solve the problem itself, and the Canadian military has done a very, very good job of doing that. I was talking to a friend recently, and I think I don't think Canada has ever been on a losing side of any military conflict. If you think the UK was on the losing side of the American War of Independence,
I would argue we got our ass kicked in Afghanistan. I think that's an L. Well, we didn't have I think we're weaseling our way out of it as a Western bloc because we didn't define the terms for success, which typically in a war is conquer, take the land, hold it, defeat the enemy. That was never part of the mission. So therefore, how did you lose? Well, I mean, everything has gone back to worse than when it was when we got there. So if that's any quantifiable measure of loss, I think that's a loss right there. So
that's it.
Yeah.
But the failure of politicians rather than the military, maybe, without setting the terms of reference.
So 100%. I had this conversation with Stu Scheller. He's the retired lieutenant colonel, Marine lieutenant colonel who blew up the internet by criticizing the general staff online while still serving.
Yeah,
he's a pragmatist and he is very principled. And he said, why are we trying to win these wars without any defined definition of what winning is? If we're here to win a war, let's win the war. And if it means attacking Taliban in Pakistan, we need to do that. That's part of the war. Right. Why are we letting them attack us from there? All these geopolitical things. It's like, but we're at war. And why were 0 generals fired for losing? And why was there was always just turnover of generals and it was just handed off and check boxes? And so I think he's right. And for us, he said, he's like, the troops on the ground, man, we did everything that was asked of us and then some. And had we had competent leadership and political leaders, we would have won the war, any war. We're incredible war fighting force. And that's what kind of stings for a lot of us and stings for myself, is that it kind of feels like it was for naught. And so that plays into like moral injury, right? That
exactly.
We're kind of duped into doing this. And then at the end of the day, it resulted in a net negative for it was sold to us like, hey, we're helping these people, but we didn't help them. It made things worse. So there's that moral injury component to at least myself and some of the Afghan vets that I know based on our service,
And completely different to the World War II veterans whose homecoming was celebrated. There was marches in every city. They won. They created a new world. Everyone was optimistic that
I can't imagine what it was like for my grandfather, right? Because he came back from the Italian campaign and, he lost a lot of friends and he was lucky to get back. And I never got to know him, but the sheer fact that you won, clearly you won. The Nazis are gone. The Japanese, their empire finished. It's Marshall Plan and let's get everything back to kick ass. And it must have been amazing to have that feeling that, okay, I survived this. Now let's make babies and let's build an amazing society so that our kids don't have to experience this ever again. This was horrific. And it's just unfortunate that we didn't get to have that feeling of victory, right?
Yeah. It's I mean, it's all. I mean, I'm sure this is a bit off topic, but also a bit of a failure of NATO, because I mean, really, it was the US, the UK, and Canada who contributed, and Australia. You know, the big numbers, and the European, continental European countries didn't. It was a NATO operation.
No,
Didn't really
Anglosphere is
contribute much.
the way I heard it described. The Anglosphere would do
Yeah,
the bulk of the heavy lifting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And they're happy to have American divisions, you know, on their soil, protecting them from the east. But you know, are they contributing to? But
I
anyway,
think
that's
we
another
just started a
conversation.
whole podcast,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, I'm not my expertise, so maybe I should keep my mouth shut before I get in trouble.
Okay, not enough people are listening, so it's fine. You'll be all right. You'll be all right, Rob. Don't worry about it. So what you're doing, just to bring this home, the veteran population, from what I understand, has a lot of work to do, but things are optimistic. There's all kinds of programs that are starting to pop up, which are having a real good impact. And from your point of view, it's really let's put some extra effort into these programs that have been showing effectiveness and helping the veteran on the ground actually get better. And then slowly but surely, with researchers like yourself and more awareness, we'll get to a point where more veterans will be healed and be able to thrive in their communities and throughout the rest of their life, if that's a good enough synopsis.
Yeah, perfectly. If I need an agent, I should keep you on board, David, because your summaries of my work are better than I could do myself. But,
I'll do your PR work. Sure, I'll do it.
Yeah. And you're a very good active listener as well, because but that's exactly it. Yeah, the bottom-up grassroots programs, which are springing up all over the country, or have existed quietly for many years, they're the ones I feel are really helping veterans. And if people can get themselves inserted into those, and if they aren't available, maybe can get together with some buddies and start something. And with the internet, it can be advertised and the word can be spread. And, these are really helpful for that kind of recovery, resilience, transitional journey.
Amazing. We'll have to get a link of your for your book up on my website as well, so folks can
That'd be great.
Can find that and start consuming your content and your YouTube channel. That's huge. You said you weren't on socials. That's a lie. That's the second largest social media platform on the planet, and you casually mentioned that you have a YouTube channel.
Well, it's true, but the good thing, or maybe bad thing, a good thing for me about YouTube is that they stopped the instant messaging function or the email, the communication function. So I avoid Twitter or Instagram or these kind of things. I don't want to be deluged with.
Right.
I was on Facebook for a short period of time, got lots of strange communications coming my way, shall we say?
Wild world. It's a wild world. Yes, exactly. I get calls sometimes. I'm like, whoa, this is going way too far. All right, you're gone. Yeah, it's a wild world. You got to take the good with the bad.
Yeah, exactly.
But Rob, I just wanted to say thanks for sharing your insights with your research and your work with the veteran community. I know this is going to be a great bit of knowledge for those that are listening, and it's going to help the community get stronger and thrive into the future. Do you have any last parting words before we sum up?
No, thank you, David. And if there's any small grassroots or larger bottom-up groups out there that would like to ever partner with a researcher, I'd be happy to receive any emails. People can email me, robert.whitley@mcgill.ca, and to get these small bottom-up grassroots programs funded and to get them accepted. Sometimes it's helpful to have research to show how they're affecting people, how they're influencing people's mental health, how they're being used, and that can be used as ballast in future applications to get funding. So always willing to work with veterans and help if I can. Yeah.
100%. And then when we figure some stuff out, we'll have to have a few pints in somewhere either in Verdun or close to the Douglas. And
most definitely. Yeah. Yeah, most definitely.
my old favorite city. So Rob, thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated. And folks, don't forget, train hard, fight easy. See you on the next one. Peace. I hate t-shirts that get floppy in the arms after 10 washes. So that's why I created a bunch of t-shirts with high quality cotton just for you so that you can go to the gym and look fresh, sport some philosophy, and smash those PRs looking good. So you need to head to davemorrow.net/merch, grab yourself a hat, grab yourself a t-shirt, grab yourself a sweater, and support the cause today.